Welcome to this webinar on the key to successful digital transformation, presented by Timeline PI. I'm Stacey Irish, the editor of PEX Network, and I'll be your moderator for this session. The presentation will take around 40 minutes, but will follow with a 15-minute question and answer session, so do stick around. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can type them into your Q&A box that appears on your screen at any time, and our speaker panel will do their best to answer them before the session ends. Please ensure you have Flash Player enabled and all your volume buttons are switched on. If you have any technical issues, such as being unable to see the slides or hear our speakers, please also use the Q&A box to let us know, and our team will provide some assistance. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to our speakers, Scott Orpiz, who is the President and CEO at Timeline PI, and Alex DiBella, who is the Senior Solutions Consultant at Timeline PI. Scott and Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning or afternoon, depending on where you all are today, and thanks for joining our session today. So this is Scott Opitz, and I'd like to sort of lead us off here with an introduction to the subject matter we're going to talk about today. As you can tell from the slide, clearly we're very focused on the idea of process intelligence and all of the capabilities around that area, and specifically how it applies to digital transformation. And if you think about digital transformation today, right, you really would have to be living in a cave, not to be bombarded daily with all of the many ideas around digital transformation from all of the consulting and advisory services organizations and as well as just everybody in industry. We find it hard to find any organization we talk to today that doesn't consider digital transformation to be at the very top of their list of priorities. Now, as we think about digital transformation, it's one of those terms which is, very loaded, right? It could have many different meanings to many different organizations. And candidly, initially, a lot of the emphasis related to digital transformation was really focused on the idea of updating access, right? So in other words, to provide our customers and our trading partners with more convenient ways to be able to access our systems and do business with us. But we've seen that expand dramatically to many other technologies, and some of which we're going to touch on today related to, how you can achieve digital transformation using technologies like robotic process automation or RPA tools, business process management, journey mapping, and the like. Now, one of the challenges, though, is that when we look at how a lot of companies have attacked this, because of this bias towards improving access is the number one priority. A lot of companies got stuck in thinking that was the bulk of where their attention should be. And unfortunately, their focus, too much so on enhancing access without underlying the improvement of those underlying processes or business processes that supported those different activities had, in fact, a very unfortunate, unintended consequence. And that is that you may provide it easier for your customers and trading partners to interact with you, but you may actually, in fact, cause them to more quickly see some of the frailties or limitations of the underlying business processes that are actually behind why they're trying to work with you in the first place. So when we think about the drivers for why we want to invest in digital transformation and why our customers do, when you think about this, right, this could be everything from improving customer satisfaction to your overall competitiveness to, revenue growth initiatives or expense reduction initiatives. It becomes pretty clear that a successful digital transformation project can't really give you the return that you're looking for unless the entire process, all of the underlying processes are optimized end to end. And, the idea being that in any industry that we're in, and there's a variety of folks in different industries represented in our attendees today, the reality is that in every industry, right, processes are everywhere. I mean, they are effectively, they're the life's blood or the nervous system of everything we do as businesses. And so, as diverse as everything from healthcare to insurance to, government services, and then very horizontal type issues that we're dealing with across every industry, such as, government compliance, accounting compliance, supply chain, sales monitoring, the things that we do regardless of the industry we're in. And so while those processes are there, it also represents a significant opportunity, right? Because if we can improve those processes, if we can, take the inefficiencies out, if we can identify opportunities for, ways to excel in these processes, right? We give ourselves a good foundation to actually get a return on all of this digital transformation investment that we're making. So managing processes better, it really begs the question of, what technologies can we use to help? And, for instance, I mentioned earlier robotic process automation and business process management, which are two very hot topics right now as far as technologies to try to improve the execution of processes underlying our operations. And in fact, I love this quote. This is from a gentleman here in the States, Nathaniel Palmer, who has been a longtime voice in the Workflow Management Coalition and around business process management, process automation for many years. And I thought he captured it really well here. And, that he views digital transformation and would define it as being that if you're going to be successful in developing that strategy, it's not about, one technology is going to solve all your problems. It's about being able to tie together discrete technologies and moments of automation, right, at different points along your process, across a comprehensive end-to-end process. So it's not about one piece of technology solving the entire problem. It's the appropriate networking of different technologies together in an optimal way to improve your process end-to-end. Now, to do this effectively, right, you've got to have strategy. And candidly, an optimal strategy requires a good understanding of your processes. And this actually raises a serious, concern, and that is, if you think about the tools that you have available to you that you and your colleagues use every day to try to understand what's going on in your business and your operation, the typical types of tools we'd expect would be BI tools. Maybe we're using some BPM technology already, either that you've implemented yourself or that some third-party product includes. There are process mining tools. People tend to do these things manually as well. And the problem is that none of them are really designed to provide you with the deep process insight that's required. Business intelligence, it has no concept of process step. It's very good at analyzing point-in-time data, providing you a variety of ways of looking at data in a more conventional way. But when it comes to temporal analysis, understanding how things are changing over time in a process, it's just not designed to do that. The BPM technologies that you may have implemented or be using as part of other package solutions that you may be taking advantage of in your organization, well, they're fine for what they control, but it's very rare that one single BPM technology actually covers your processes end to end. And even when they do, they're somewhat limited in their analytics capabilities. There have been attempts through what generally are called process mining tools to be able to, perhaps load up some data and be able to give you some simple visualizations that would be able to describe your very your simplest processes, right, your most consistently executed processes. But the problem is these don't typically represent real-world processes, right? In real-world processes, we may have a lot of ad hoc exceptions. There could be a number of issues that the process mining tools don't really handle. And so what a lot of organizations are left to is taking a manual approach, right, where somebody has to go and try to hobble together all of the data that they can find and then manually try to reconstruct how processes are being executed. So this is something that we see as a significant hole in the marketplace, right? It's something that just is not being serviced very well, and without it, we think is a great inhibitor to organizations' ability to get the insight they need to actually develop that strategy. And so, of course, because of this problem, right, you end up with this issue of you can't improve what you don't understand. So Timeline PI, our organization, and what we hope to show you here through the rest of today's webinar is a very new approach to analyzing your data to give you the ability to figure out strategies for optimizing, improvements to your processes, and then the ability to actually monitor those business processes once those improvements have been put into effect. And this works in conjunction with all of the technology we've talked about. So if you're using robotic process automation or BPM or if they're just old legacy systems where the processing, logic is deeply embedded in those systems, it has the ability to work across all of those different types of environments. So let me describe really quickly kind of how it fits together, and then I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague Alex Deibler, who's going to actually take you through a real-world example of this that I think will make it make a lot of sense. So the technology is built around a new patent-pending technology we've developed called timeline analysis. And it's really, if you can think about it, as having sort of three phases or three pillars of capability that arises from this technology. The first is what we would consider to be sort of the discovery mode, right? What's going on in my current environment? What's my current state? What's my baseline? The ability to then jump in and do some deep analysis. And then finally, after doing that analysis and hopefully taking some actions to maybe improve your processes, you then can actually go off and monitor it in production or at runtime to make sure that the end result is actually yielding the benefits that you had hoped to achieve. So if we dive into this a little further, this first phase, right, this what we would call the discovery phase, right, is all about building your baseline. How are things working today? If you think about it, if you're going to go off and undertake a major process reengineering, business process implementation project, or a robotic process automation type project, you can't really do that unless you know how things work today, right? You need to know how things work today for two reasons, right? One is, well, if you're going to automate it, you better understand what you're automating, right? You have to have kind of the recipe, if you will, for the automation. But even more importantly, we don't typically have just one process that we're dealing with, right? We have dozens to hundreds of processes depending on our organization or our scope of visibility in that organization. And so as a result, there's a question right off the top, which is which process would give us the greatest benefit of optimizing? So just understanding that baseline, and we offer a variety of tools you're going to see here in a moment to help you with the ability to do that. And then once you understand your baseline, the next natural question is, all right, I need to be able to experiment a little bit and be able to figure out what would be the best plan for optimization. So this is where we need to bring in our analysis tools. So the ability to query, to look for specific types of patterns, to understand how different time is invested or expended in particular process steps, the ability to understand where different teams or different parts of my organization are interacting with each other in a workflow fashion, how well is that working and where are the opportunities associated with it that could be improved. So again, getting a deep understanding, starting to build your plan for how you're going to improve things, and then being able to validate that it actually works that way based on the real data of your organization. And then finally, as we get to the final phase, it's all about monitoring. Because one of the big challenges, and this is something that's been borne out by a lot of the research, is that even the organizations who've taken the initiative to do process reengineering efforts and implement the use of technology to improve the execution of their processes, they have the problem that depending on how well they're monitored and enforced, there's a tendency in a lot of organizations for users to backslide to the way that they were more familiar with historically of doing something. And so even after all of this investment, you have to ensure that you're actually complying with the new approach. And of course, you also have to be objective enough to be able to say, well, once I've implemented this new approach, I have to be willing to ask the question, am I actually yielding the benefits that I would have expected to yield based on my original plan? So let's say that I'm going to implement a major automation project using RPA. Well, I should at least know what my baseline is of what it cost me to implement or deliver that process, whatever it represents originally. And then I should be able to measure in the automated form, are we actually getting the yield of productivity that we would expect to get based on our original plan? And by the way, we won't always get that exactly as we planned, but having that insight would then give us the ability to say, how might we tweak it? How might we modify it to actually realize those types of yields? So with that, that's hopefully a good overview for you. Happy to circle back on any of these things later in the Q&A portion. But right now, I'd like to turn it over to Alex Deibler. Alex is a senior solutions consultant with Timeline PI, and he's going to take you through a demonstration today that will actually show you the Timeline PI technology in action. So Alex, over to you.
All right, thanks for that, Scott. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Scott mentioned I'm going to be going through the demonstration here. And one of the concepts behind this demonstration is to show you how simple it is to get going with this tool, with Timeline PI. Now, anybody can show you a nicely polished, kind of well-defined demonstration of a tool, but really the question becomes, that's great, but how much work does it take for me to get there, right? Now, since this tool, Timeline PI, is solely focused on analyzing a business process or a temporal set of steps, we can tell you with a high degree of confidence, as soon as I upload the data, I can give you many different ways to analyze your business process and best practices. So we're going to start by pointing out to a file that's got some data related to an insurance claims process flow. So we're going to be tracking the life cycle of a vehicle claim as it goes through an insurance provider, right? So I'm going to browse out to a file that's got some event-related data for this insurance claims process. Now we've introspected that file, and there's three key fields here, three required fields that are necessary in order to get going with the tool, and that's really it. The first field is going to be our timestamp, right? This is going to tell us when each one of these events related to these insurance claims has occurred. Next is going to be our timeline ID. Now this is going to be our unique identifier, which is going to allow us to join together all the different events in a given claim instance into the same context. So you can think in this example, we'd be using something like a claim number or a claim ID. We could also use data like a policy ID or a customer ID, really any type of unique identifier which is going to signify what we're looking to track and measure. Now the last required field we're going to need is our event name. Now this is simply going to tell us what piece of work happened at that step. So for this example, things like the first notice of loss was submitted, we assigned an adjuster on the claim, maybe we completed a fraud check, some of the examples we'll see. So these are the only three required fields we'll need in order to get going with this analysis. Apart from that, you can see the fields we have mapped in purple, which would be our dimensions or our attributes of these claims. These are going to be the fields that are going to allow us to slice and dice, filter, break down the data, give more context to our analysis by. So for this example, things like the adjuster on the claim, what state was it submitted in, the claim priority, the amount, and so on. All right. Now it's worth mentioning that this is a relatively simplistic example that I'm going through. I'm pointing out to a single file, which I believe contains all the data which underlies this process. In the real world, that's not realistic, right? There are many different systems that are going to underlie a complex business process, and these timelines can be assembled from those multiple files that would correspond to different systems of record. So different events are going to come from totally separate sources. As long as these different sources contain this shared object identifier, this ID, the tool will be able to connect them together and insert the correct events into their corresponding timelines, right? So we've mapped some columns in this file. What I would do now is simply hit load and allow the tool to begin reconstructing the process based on these events. So I'm not going to waste our time as a part of this webinar today doing this. I've already loaded the data for this demo. If I had loaded it, it would have taken about 90 seconds to load what we have here, which is more than 500,000 events related to these claims. Now in that time, it's going to reconstitute the process, build all the models, and create the multiple forms of analysis that we're going to be touching on. So once we've successfully loaded data, we're presented with the overview page, which includes quite a few metrics, as you can see, which are going to give us a better understanding about our project and the data that we've uploaded. The first thing I'll point your attention to here in the middle, almost 550,000 events came out of that file and have been mapped into roughly 31,600 timelines, or in this case, a timeline is going to be synonymous with a claim. Right? We pulled out 31 different types of events from that data. I'll pop that up and give you a look. So here's the full list of all the different events which occurred as a part of these claims, and you can sort them by the most commonly occurring or those associated with the most amount of timelines or claims. Now, just in the interest of full disclosure, I said I was going to show you getting started from scratch. The only thing that I've done configuration-wise, other than take the time to load the data, is to assign a couple of icons to be used here for some of these key events, as opposed to the default number circle with a number in the middle, as you can see. So I'll just show you how simply that can be done. You can assign your own icons, use ones we provide, assign coloring to certain events. The idea here is that we're going to make it visually obvious to end users as soon as they come into the tool exactly what's happening with these insurance claims, in what order, and the icons will help us do that. And you'll see here in a moment when we get to the timelines view where that'll become apparent. So everything else automatically been done by the technology. Some of the other metrics we've got here. Along the top, we've got the average duration as well as the range of duration of our claims process. So on average, we close out claims in 23 days, but it could span anywhere from 6 hours to 15 months. The number of events in our claim instances. And we've also got some metrics related to cost. So we have a cost area of the tool where we can put in some cost statistics and actually start to understand, for this full population, 31,596 claims, it's cost us $4 million to process those with an average cost per claim of $123. Okay, and we'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment. And the last thing to mention here is the distribution of the first and last events in this claims process. Essentially, which events are both most commonly starting and finishing this process. And just to give you a look, you can pop up this last event and get a full breakdown here, all the different events which have finished off our claims process with the frequency breakdown of all of those here. So from here, we'll quickly move to the timelines view. We'll look at the actual process path that the tool has generated. Now, each one of these horizontal lines is a timeline. It represents a separate claim, and those circles with the icons that I mentioned represent an event or a step that happened as a part of that process. Now, if I scroll this to the right, you'll see that the length is actually proportionate to the elapsed time. So some of these, of course, are going to span longer than others. And we can also see some interesting areas where we've got gaps in between events where essentially nothing is happening as a part of these claims and they're waiting to be processed. Now, if I click on any one of these timelines, it's going to give me much more detail as to specifically what has happened with this claim, in what order, and at what time. So this screen is now showing me details specific to timeline or claim number X, essentially. Now, this column that was all the way to the left is the superset of all the events which occurred as a part of this claim. So we can see when first notice of loss is submitted, we have coverage confirmation, and we sign an adjuster, so on and so forth. All the way down the line, you have associated time gaps. We've also got all the attribute-related data available to us, so who was associated with this claim, where did it come from, and so on. So all the way until you can see eventually this claim, it looks like, was closed out. All right, so very detailed information on each one of these claims. What happens here if I turn on the sub-processes, these additional columns to the right, the tool is automatically figured out by analyzing specific patterns in this data, which things are most commonly done together or as mutually exclusive steps. So in other words, it automatically detected those which are done as sub or parallel processes, and you can see them grouped out here together. So I'll give you a quick example. You would imagine every insurance claim is going to have a first notice of loss, a coverage confirmation, maybe a fraud check on it. But not every claim, if we're talking about vehicle claims, is going to have an injury claim submitted as a part of it, or a rental car issued, or total loss with corresponding salvage information. And so you can see those types of events broken out here, grouped together as sub-processes. And in this specific insurance use case, you're going to see the things grouped together which correspond to the major categories of a claim, which are coverage, liability, damages, subrogation, and salvage where it applies. Okay. Now, if we think about that example I mentioned of loading up data across multiple source systems, what we're essentially doing here is piecing together the composite life cycle of this claim throughout the entire process, regardless of the system of record that's responsible for recording any of these given events. All right. And it's worth mentioning the engine itself doesn't know the first thing about insurance or claims processing. Right? The use case really, it's totally use case agnostic. So we could just as easily be doing this with underwriting, sales, invoice, patient processing. We have a whole host of different use cases on our website, but it's totally agnostic to that. The idea is to give users a much better understanding of what's going on in their business process very, very quickly, regardless of the vertical that's being supported. So we'll hop back into the timeline view, and I can tell you there's a huge amount of variability in this claims process. After having worked with this data, there are actually no two timelines which are chronologically going to be identical. So you might ask, and oftentimes we're asking in the beginning of an engagement with a customer, this is great, and that level of detail is nice, but it's a lot to digest. Is there a way to map a process diagram that's going to give me a general idea for what my dominant path is through this process? Right? Now, this is actually a question that may seem simplistic, but most businesses will struggle to answer. Right? What's my dominant path through my claims process? Using my existing technology set, there's no easy way to do that, and it's a big reason why a lot of people can't tell you with a high amount of confidence exactly how their processes are being executed from start to finish. So let's take a look at our process schema editor, and that will allow us to visually map that out, and we'll create a new one. So I'll just name it, and we'll initialize a new schema. So we'll start by allowing the software to take what it believes to be the most important milestone event. So I have my full list of events here. And when I click Select Default Milestones, what's happening is we're running advanced statistical analysis, specifically picking the events which are most reliably and commonly occurring at the same point in this process. So it looks like it picked 10 events as milestones that are happening at the same point in this workflow, and that's great. We can always customize this, so let's add a few more to the model. Let's take a look at where claims are being denied, maybe where estimates are being prepared, and where fraud check is happening. All right, so I've added a few more. We'll have it generate the schema for us. Now this is showing us that most common schema based on the milestones, which essentially I said that I care about. Okay, so it's showing us that most common path. The nice thing here is that this is not just a static Visio diagram. Once I save it, it now becomes a monitoring tool. It can tell me the number of claims which have gone one transition or path through the process versus another. So you can mouse over and get the number of transitions which have gone one path versus another, and you can see the thickness of the line obviously represents that more claims, more volume has gone one direction versus another. Right? If I don't want to look at this by volume and rather by the amount of time that's actually being spent in between these milestone events, I can change my metric here on the right. So I'll change this, and the thickness of the line will now represent the time length of the transition. So I can clearly see where the longest average duration is occurring as a part of this process, right? And to go back to Scott's point about understanding my as-is state and looking for the low-hanging fruit and return based on process reengineering or RPA efforts, this would be a good place to start, right? Where are we spending the bulk of our time that's a part of this process? Let's look for candidates that would be ripe for automation within this segment to try to drive down that average duration, right? Or try to work and work with our employees to make sure they're more efficient in handling this specific sub-process, right? But this is going to clearly show you where time is being spent. The last thing I want to show here is the ability to animate this. So when I turn on this animation, what we're going to see is each one of these circles represents a claim or a group of claims. We can see as things are progressing, where they're slowing down, where they're backing up and bottlenecking, right, and grouping up here within the process. Now, I just paused this, but you can clearly see where things are slowing down and backing up. And if there's anything that stands out, is, you know, as they're actually changing colors, they're aging within the process. So you can see as they're going from yellow to orange, they're getting closer towards this 23-day in process. And if there's anything that stands out, for instance, this claim up here towards the top that somehow is still up towards coverage confirmed after over 20 days in the process, I can actually click on any one of these and dynamically drill in to that claim's specific details, right? Start to better understand exactly what happened with this instance, who was associated with it, and so on, right? But this is going to clearly start to show us where there may be some inefficiencies within the process at a macro level. Okay, so now we have a much better idea of generally how claims are going through this process. I want to introduce a form of analysis that's going to show us the amount of variability within the process. okay? And that's going to be our path analysis. So this may put it in a way that's easier to begin analyzing for certain people. And those interested in Lean, Six Sigma, anybody concerned with continuous improvement oftentimes likes this type of view of the data. What we're looking at is a frequency distribution of all the different process execution paths with the most commonly followed behaviors here shown towards the left. So we've got our different events, and along the top you can see the count of timelines or claims, right, which have in a descending order, which have gone one behavior versus another. And we can clearly see here where steps are being skipped, things are being done repeatedly, out of order, maybe pinballing back and forth between different cues or steps. And as I scroll to the right, you're going to get more and more interesting and obscure behaviors, okay? Now, along with the volume of claims which have gone one path versus another, right, we can start to see what's our average duration. This is 1,704 claims have taken this quote-unquote straight-through process, it looks like, right? That's great, but that's only 5.4% of our total population. Now, I can see that it takes, on average, those claims to take 17 days versus the next one to the right, which takes 6 days on average longer, right? So when you think about a process improvement perspective, not only can we spot things like non-compliant processes, where we're skipping steps and going back and obviously not following best practices, but we can also find the most time-efficient way of doing this and a set of behaviors that allow us to turn these claims around as fast as possible in the most compliant way possible, right? Now, we can take this even a step further, and I can change this average duration per path metric to look at it by average cost. So I can see exactly how costly is it on average for us to execute a series of steps, one versus another. And it looks like there's a glaring example here, right, where I have $110 for the first two, but the third is almost $100 more expensive for me to generate claims going this path. And we have a relatively high variance number of claims actually executing this behavior. So not only can we do the compliance and the timing efficiency, but we can bring the bottom line into play here. We want to push people towards a more cost-effective way of completing this process based on the average cost per claim of any one of these given behaviors. Now, if any one of these stands out to me and I want to drill a bit further in on it, what I can do is select that specific claim path or behavior path, apply it as a filter. Now when I go back to my timelines view, I'm only looking at those 1,196 claims which exhibited that specific behavior that were extremely costly, right? And now we're going to get into some modules that are going to allow us to look for root cause, where and why is this occurring, so that we can go make sure that it doesn't happen going forward. Okay, but that filtering is going to become a theme you'll see as we go. We'll start with our large data set. We'll use some of these analysis modules to drill in and uncover the interesting things that are happening within the process. So relating back to Scott's slides, right, that was what we just covered was really the discovery pillar. Very little configuration necessary. I load up my data. I'm presented with things like a schema, a path, a number of different metrics that are going to tell me what's my current as-is state. Now that we have that understanding, let's move on and we'll take a look at some of the analysis modules. And so when I'm looking with my full data set, it's going to be helpful to use these metrics along the top to start to get a better understanding of our data, right? As I mentioned before, it's really hard to wrap your arms around 31,600 cases. So these metrics are always going to be representative of the set of timelines which we have in the window below. So you're going to see these recalculate and change dynamically as we start to filter and scope our analysis, just like we did with the past. So right now we're looking across all 31,000 plus claims. And then you're looking at this duration metric. The fact that there's at least one case that takes 15 months to complete, that stands out a bit. It seems a bit protracted. Let's drill a bit further into this. So when I click on my duration metric, I'm now presented with a histogram that shows me the distribution of my cases by their duration. So we can see the minimum time 6 hours, the average is 23 days, and the maximum is 15 months. Now, fortunately, we have a large spike here towards the left at the beginning of this histogram, which shows us that the majority of our cases are done in far less than 15 months. That's great. What we can actually do is adjust this slider dynamically and start to get a feel for, setting at 42 days, how many claims have been processed in under or longer than 42 days. So it looks like 94% almost of our claims are done in less than 42 days, but there are still 6.1% or 1,942, which is a relatively large number, which are these outliers that are between 42 days and 15 months. Now, we're going to come back to this. We can take this histogram analysis a step further. So if I'm curious if there's a specific call center or adjuster that may be taking their time with these claims, I can actually break this histogram down by any one of those attributes that you saw me load. So let's do it by adjuster. Let's say I want to look at the different adjusters assigned to these claims. And when I do this, each one of my respective adjusters has a histogram relative to their own claims, their book of business. So we can do a visual comparison as to which one of these may not look like the others, which one is skewed further than we would expect it. And I can tell you within this data set, Jim Ricks looks a little bit off. Right? This is not the same as the others. So keep your eye on this general average. Our typical average is 23 days, 7 hours. When I sub in Jim's histogram, it's 2 months longer on average for Jim to process a claim. Right? Now, if I'm interested in driving down this claim closeout time, I know who I want to go have a conversation with. Jim, why is it taking you 2 months longer on average to process the claim? Is it the complexity? Do you need some kind of training or procedural help? Either way, very quickly and easily can I visually understand, right, by adjuster, who's taking longer than others. We won't pick on Jim. I'll remove him from the filter and we'll go back and we'll set to our general 42-day time frame. As the analyst, we're going to want to look at these 1942 claims that span longer than 42 days. So let's apply this as a filter. All right. So now, again, we're looking at 1942 that are longer than the 42 days. And one thing that a lot of insurance providers are concerned with is making sure that they get all the necessary information from the customer or third party as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. Because if we fail to get a certain piece of data or a document, we then have to iteratively go back out to that customer to request it, and that's not always going to be completed in a timely manner. And then each time this subsequently happens, we're elongating the claim itself. Not only that, but you're causing more and more friction from the end customer perspective. So this requirement for more information is something of interest. What I can actually do is select this specific event here in my timeline, and now you'll see I have a histogram that shows me, relative to this requirement for more information event, how often is it occurring within this set of timelines. Also, what are our most common events that come up both prior to and post this event? If there's any rhyme or reason why these things would be triggering that, I can start to understand that. Now, what we'll see here is that this requirement for more information could happen anywhere between 0 and 4 times, which would seem like an inordinate amount of time to have to go back to a customer to get information. So if we're really interested in drilling further, I could say, let's just look at those that have 3 or 4 requirement for more information events and apply that as a filter. But instead, I want to get a little bit more quantitative about this and start to understand exactly how much time does it cost us each time we have to reach back out to a customer to ask for information to move the claim forward. We can use our time interval measurement tool to start to understand that. So this actually has my settings from earlier, but what we're looking at here is the delta in time between a requirement for more info event and that additional information being flagged as having been received. So how long does it take us to complete this sub-process, for example? And it looks like, again, we get the minimum, the average, and the maximum, as we do with all the analysis, right? And the average is 4 days, and the maximum is almost 54 days, right? And then to add insult to injury, that would be a huge amount of time to wait. We saw in this event's histogram, this could be happening up to 4 times in each one of these claims. Now, that would be far, far too many times to happen and far, far too long to be these claims to be sitting and waiting for information to move them forward. Right, so now we better understand, this could be an issue with how long it's taking us to process these claims, okay? But now I want to get a little bit more into the root cause. Let's try to figure out, great, I understand this is happening. I understand part of the process that may be slowing us down. Is there anything from a trend perspective that's going to point me in the direction of where I can go to fix this? All right, let's figure out the root cause. And we can use our breakdown tool to take a look at that. So this is going to break it down by any one of those attributes you saw us load in the beginning. Right now it looks like it's using the state. So here are all the different states that we've had claims submitted in, and nothing really interesting here, right? There's a pretty even distribution. Nothing stands out. Now let's choose to break it down by a different attribute. And let's say maybe the agent on the claim. And this is fitting because the agent is the one responsible for actually retrieving the information from the customer. So they should be the one that's getting all the info up front. Now when we choose to break it down by agent, you know what, there's something interesting here. It looks like Carrie Ann is the agent who's responsible for almost 40% or 712 of these long-running claims, right? So this, again, similar to that point I made with Jim, if we need to go have a conversation with somebody, I'm starting with Carrie Ann. What's going on with these claims that are taking them so long for you to process, right? I know 712 have been in your bucket, and we go down the line from here. And if I want to get a little bit more detail as to exactly what's going on with Carrie Ann, maybe she's just getting the more difficult claims to handle, I can click on her name, apply it as a filter. Now when I go back to my timelines view, I only get those 712 claims that Carrie Ann was responsible for. And I can start to understand better exactly what's going on with her business, right? So I want to quickly touch on, I've set two filters here. The duration longer than 42 days, and Carrie Ann was the agent on those claims. So I'll just show you, we have the ability to save this filter configuration now as a set. So if I want to come back, and I know I want to look at this specific config, you can imagine I can build out 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different filters. And if I don't want to waste my time making all those clicks the next time I come in, I know I want to analyze this specific subset of the data. I save it as a set, and in just a couple of clicks, I come back and I look at that brand new filter configuration based on the new data that's been loaded since the last time I ran my analysis. Okay. I can also look at the inverse of any one of these filters by hitting that inverse and quickly just get the inverse of any one of them. Anyhow, I want to move on and look at some of the other different analysis modules, and one that I think is really powerful is our search or query mechanism. So if you think about a traditional business intelligence search, it's going to go off and look for objects by using, what's their current attribute, the current status. But if you need to look for things from more of a historical perspective, BI is not really going to help you with that. So if we want to build a pattern-based search, BI doesn't really have any concept of related events or a process. But I'll pose a scenario. If somebody were to ask this question, how often do we have rental cars being issued on claims with no record of a coverage confirmation happening, and then subsequently that claim is denied after we've already incurred the cost of the rental car? Okay, and it seems like something logically probably shouldn't happen, but by using a BI search, you're really not going to be able to answer that type of a question without a whole heap of custom code or even a custom application. So I just want to show you how we graphically build that out. So we'll say we got what we expect to be a coverage confirmation event followed by a rental car being issued on the claim, and then subsequently the claim comes back as being denied, but we missed this coverage confirmation step. So this has not happened. Yet we issued a rental car and the claim was denied, right? Just a quick hypothesis test. Is this happening within our business process? When I click search, you're going to see a very quick response time on a relatively complex claim that tells you, you know what, in 91 claims, you had that exact sequence of events occur. Missed coverage confirmation, issued a rental car, and the claim was denied. Now, the beauty of these queries is they don't need to be as simple as you saw me build this out. So let's add a bit more to it. We'll say, once we send a denial notice out to our claimant, thankfully, they decided to bring the rental car back, which is great. But let's say the time gap in between them getting the denial notice and the rental car being returned, let's say that's longer than 4 days. So they decided to take their time bringing the car back, which would in turn drive up the cost of the essentially non-compliant claim to our business. Okay, so you can build in time extremely granularly into any of these transitions, start to get a better idea of exactly where time is being lost as a part of going in between these events or parts of the process. Not only that, we can look at repetitions, so just a couple other things we can do here with the query. Let's look at those that had 2 or more rental cars issued on it, not just one. Or we can use any of the attributes here to get very detailed as to specific adjuster, states, so on and so forth, or compare last week versus this week, right, using time. Anyhow, we've added a bit more to this query. Let's go off and search it. And yeah, you know what? In 44 of those claims, our claimant decided to wait longer than 4 days before they brought the car back, right? Now, these queries, this is great, right? We can quickly go off and test a hypothesis to run it to ground. Is it happening? Is it not? These are also set up to be able to trigger alerts. So I don't need to be sitting and babysitting this data all day long. I can create a condition that is going to fire off when conditions are met in my data that are going to make people aware that these specific cases are occurring, right? And we're going to build another level of accountability into that process, making sure when we go, we analyze, we uncover these interesting things that are happening. We want to make sure that we remediate that going forward and that people don't go back to that old behavior. And we can use alerts and in this query and both in protocols I'm going to get to here in a second. So from query, I want to move into protocols. And as you get into more specialized forms of asking questions, this is where protocol analysis will fit. A good example that I typically point to is in financial services. So most people are familiar if you apply for a loan or a mortgage, you have to get certain disclosures, signatures, good faith estimates, things that the government is going to require are taken into account. And these things are mandated, and if they're not done the prescribed way, you're going to be in violation of federal law, and your loan application is going to be null and void, right? So likewise, most processes are going to include areas where when we get to a certain point, there are things that absolutely must happen, and oftentimes within a given time range. So in comparison to a query is essentially a search condition. It says, give me all the cases that match the condition that I've set forth. A protocol is going to allow me to define a set of rules, which I believe should always be followed, and is going to show us the timelines that violate that rule. Because if things are following protocol, I'm not concerned, right? That's the expected behavior. But this is going to be the inverse of that query in that it's not going to show us the things that match. It will highlight the things that don't match, the things that aren't following protocol. So what we've got on screen is a simple salvage protocol I created. When we confirm a vehicle as a total loss, we want to make sure that it's salvaged in a timely manner because each day that it's sitting on the lot, it's essentially a depreciating asset. So this protocol says that once we have an estimate prepared and approved and we've confirmed it as a total loss, I want to make sure that that vehicle is salvaged within 10 days. Otherwise, it's sitting longer and depreciating. So these are the critical conditions and business logic that we expect has been built into our process. We want to make sure it's being followed. So just like with a query, this protocol can be saved, run as an alert to let us know any time that it's been violated. So I may have an alert at 8 days and another one at 9 days so we can make sure we're not going to breach this unacceptable threshold. But as opposed to only looking at new data loaded into the system, we can also use this for analysis on our historical data. So if I click Show Violations, here are all the various ways that this protocol was violated, but not just that it was violated, it also shows us the root cause because there's a number of different possible ways that it could be violated. So we want detailed information. An event happened in the wrong position or it was missing altogether. We had a time violation, right? This is very specific as to how this protocol was violated. And one big consideration is you don't want to flood somebody with false positives, right? These are critical. We only want the things that really matter. So if things are not of interest, we can certainly choose to hide different violations and then choose to drill in on to those that are of interest, right, by applying that filter and actually just look at those timelines that exhibited that specific protocol violation and apply it as a filter as you've seen me do. I'm not going to do it on this example. Okay. So from here, one last thing that I'll touch on, I know I'm running a little bit late on time, but I just want to show is our dashboarding capability. So something for a business user who may not be an analyst, right? You may not want to be logging in this tool to do deep level analysis, but you still want to keep your finger on the pulse of your business process and the organization. I have certain company goals, high level initiatives that I need to monitor. So we do have a basic dashboarding capability for those users. And as you can see, it's more familiar. It's a little bit less daunting than that timeline view or the queries that we're building. That's where the analysts will live. So the charts on this dashboard are totally interactive in the sense I can click on that and drill to the level of timelines that made up a portion of this pie. for example, right? You can visually set these up so it's easy to configure by changing the layout, defining a metric, and specifying exactly what makes the most sense for each person or business unit, right? The one thing I want to stress is that this is not a BI dashboard, not meant to be a supplement for, or excuse me, a replacement for a BI tool. This is simply a way of surfacing up information that's directly related to the kind of analysis, that process intelligence that the Timeline PI tool can do and that you've seen us go through so far. Okay, so from a demo perspective, I think that's all that I wanted to share. So I can open it up for questions now. Stacey.
Thanks, Scott and Alex. That was very interesting. We now have time for some audience participation. Many of you have already submitted questions, but if anyone has more, please type them into the Q&A box on your screen and send them in now. I have one question. How do you capture all the process events, particularly when they occur in different systems or applications?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Alex?
So sorry. God, do you want to touch on that?
No, go ahead. No, please, go ahead.
Okay. Sure. So yeah, certainly, Scott, you can jump in. But I was going to say, I mentioned getting events from multiple different systems of record. Unlike the example that I showed, right, which was relatively simplistic. So what we can actually do is we have a set of data management utilities that will assist you with connecting into a myriad different relational data stores to pull in data from really any type of application that is storing the data that you're interested in analyzing in this tool. So those data management utilities can be configured to reach in to those data systems, pull the data out. We can then run transformation using those utilities to prepare the data, make sure it's ready for analysis, and then actually output that data in a format that can be loaded into the tool. And this can all be run in an automated fashion. So those data management utilities can be really, really helpful in going to get data, which may otherwise be difficult to get your hands on from a user interface perspective, and transform it, prepare it so it's ready for analysis, and then upload it into the tool. Again, all based on a scheduled time interval, right? Because we don't necessarily want to be manually loading data into the tool.
Fantastic. And I have another question for you. Your example was based on an insurance example. How applicable is this to healthcare?
So this is Scott, I'll take that. Well, as Alex mentioned earlier, the solution itself is completely industry agnostic. So it can be used with any data set representing any processes from any industry. And in fact, it's actually used heavily by healthcare providers, so that if you think about everything from, if you think of the process being how a patient, flows through some set of services they're getting, whether they're experienced in the emergency department or through some, say an admission for a surgery or some other treatment, just tracking a patient. It could also be tracking things like lab tests as they're submitted, or X-ray processing that has to be done. So pretty much anything that could happen on the clinical side. There's also on the business side of things like processing payments through revenue cycle management or procurement or any other part of the hospital operations. And to that extent, the same is true of applications in life sciences and pharmaceuticals for compliance monitoring, supply chain tracking, variety of use cases. We're also used in financial services areas like wealth management, commercial banking, a variety of cases like that. So it really is applicable across all of them. The insurance example just gives us a way of showing a variety of the features.
Okay, I have another question for you. We are doing both BPM and RPA projects. Where does this fit with those products?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I touched on that in the slides leading into it. There are really sort of two primary use cases related to those types of projects. One is, if you think about what we talked about as the first pillar, right, the discovery phase, you have to determine your baseline. So before you undertake a project, right, before you start building something, you have to understand what it is you're building and prioritize what part of it you attempt first. And so as an analysis tool, simply to say, what's the current state of my operation? How are things working today? Where are there opportunities for improvement? Where am I spending? Alex showed you some things related to the cost of how different processes, different variations on processes could vary. Where am I losing the most money, or where do I have the opportunity to get the best gain? So on that front side, all of that analysis to prepare you for what to implement and how to prioritize which processes ought to be attempted first, whether using RPA or BPM technology, it's certainly that. The second part is, though, once we put those solutions in place, it's rare that I'm going to have, certainly I'm never ever going to have a single bot in RPA that's going to automate everything, and I'm not going to have all of my steps of every process I do under the control of one BPM system, right? So the ability to be able to monitor both those steps which have been automated, those things that you've done to put under the control of an RPA or a BPM technology, and how it relates to other steps which are not yet automated in the same way. So that ability to do the post-implementation monitoring to make sure that, number one, people are actually doing things the way that you prescribed, and then secondly, to make sure that it's actually yielding the results that you had intended in case you have to go in and do any particular fine-tuning.
Okay, thank you. And I have the fourth and final question for you. Is the timeline tool capable of analyzing data from systems like ServiceNow or Salesforce?
Yeah, I can touch on that one. The answer is absolutely. So I just went through, in a prior question, the example of using a set of data management utilities to reach into different data storage. In that example, where you have a web system like Salesforce or ServiceNow, we actually have some direct cloud-to-cloud connectors built so we can totally alleviate the need to have to use those data management utilities and load directly from those cloud-based systems into the Timeline PI tool. And those are two good examples, actually, the ServiceNow and Salesforce. So tracking things like trouble tickets that have been submitted through the ServiceNow interface. ServiceNow doesn't currently allow you to relate all of the different tasks that are associated and escalations that are associated with these incidents. And a tool like this allows you to get a very granular look at the timeline of all of your different incidents in ServiceNow, as well as the interrelated tasks and all the activities that are occurring along the way up until you're able to close out that incident. And likewise in Salesforce, being able to directly connect into your Salesforce instance and track things like sales opportunities and the maturation of these opportunities to say, when we complete this set of behaviors, we're more likely to close an opportunity, or when we only reach out to the customer in this level of time increments, right? We can start to understand best practices about the series or the evolution of sales opportunities as they progress in a pipeline, right? So those are two good ones, and we actually have the ability to directly connect and into those cloud systems and pull the data in on a scheduled basis.
Okay, and I have one last question. So you don't have to prepare the business domain systems by adding event hooks, trace points to capture the process events for Timeline PI?
Now, that's exactly right. It's a very good question. Not every system is created equal. So some systems, particularly newer systems maybe deployed in the last 10, 15 years, will do a far better job at being able to record the events and the different activities that have happened inside those systems or under the control of those systems. And one of the reasons for that is if you think about all of the regulations that have been put into place over the last 10, 15 years with the financial crisis and privacy issues and the like, most modern systems are absolutely required for compliance reasons to be able to track audit trails associated with all of the actions inside those systems. And most modern systems, even where they're not so much compliance related, like Salesforce automation or other CRM type systems, they just, because of their architecture, like Alex just talked about Salesforce and ServiceNow as two really great examples of systems that do a very good job of tracking every time a change is made in the environment. So no, you really should not ever have to go back in and artificially insert hooks or connection points to a system. You should be able to use either direct transaction logs, audit logs, or other archival systems that will actually store the trace points for what is happening in those systems in their normal operation. There is the potential that as you deal with very old systems, right? If you happen to be working with a very old legacy system that doesn't necessarily provide an easy access to that information, typically even like old mainframe systems, they still have the ability that you can actually get log files from those systems. You'll just have to export the log file.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott and Alex. And that brings us to a close today. For now, I'd like to thank our speakers for providing their time and insight, as well as all of those in the audience who took part in this session. Thank you for your participation and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.